There is a moment almost no one talks about, a moment that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. No shouting, no revenge, no collapse. But psychologically, it is an earthquake. Carl Jung uncovered something that deeply unsettles narcissistic personalities, not because it makes the empath cruel, but because it makes them unreachable. And narcissists cannot survive what they cannot access. This moment happens when the empath is no longer wounded, but finished. Not bitter, not hardened, not vengeful, just done. Jung described this as an alchemical turning point, a psychic reaction where poison is not expelled but absorbed, digested, and transformed into something else entirely. He called this process psychological alchemy, and once it happens, the empath does not become dangerous in the way the world expects. They become unbreakable. Most people misunderstand empaths. They assume empathy is weakness. They believe sensitivity means fragility. They think kindness equals naivety. But Jung saw something very different. He believed empaths possess what he called authentic being, a psyche rooted in lived experience rather than image. Narcissists, on the other hand, do not live from being. They live from persona, masks, reflections, borrowed energy, and constant external validation. Where the empath feels deeply, the narcissist performs deeply, and this difference changes everything once the empath reaches their limit. A narcissist feeds on reaction, admiration, fear, confusion, emotional turbulence. This is what Jung would later conceptualize as a form of psychological vampirism, not evil in a cinematic sense, but unconscious. The narcissist does not drain because they enjoy cruelty. They drain because they are empty. The empath, meanwhile, has always been full but leaking energy, leaking forgiveness, leaking understanding, leaking chances, until one day they stop. And that is when the balance of power flips. Jung warned that the most dangerous psychological transformation is not rage, it is integration. Because when the empath integrates what they were trained to suppress, anger, boundaries, discernment, self-authority, they do not swing into cruelty, they swing into clarity. This is where Jung introduced the principle of enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposite when carried to an extreme. Excessive empathy eventually becomes sovereignty. Endless giving becomes self-possession. Silence becomes presence, and presence is terrifying to those who rely on manipulation. Here is the part narcissists never expect. The empath doesn't fight back. They withdraw psychic access. No more explaining, no more defending, no more proving reality, just an internal shift. And suddenly, manipulation has nowhere to land. Jung believed this moment marks the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming whole, not good, not moral, not socially approved, whole, and wholeness does not negotiate with dysfunction. This is why a fed-up empath is not loud. They are calm. They don't expose the narcissist. They don't chase justice. They don't beg for closure. They simply stop participating in the illusion. And illusion is the narcissist's oxygen. Jung once wrote that the greatest burden a human can carry is an unlived life. The empath has lived too much for others. The narcissist has lived too little within themselves. When the empath stops offering their inner world as shelter, the narcissist is forced to face their own emptiness, and that confrontation is unbearable. This is the alchemical moment, the moment when suffering becomes insight, when pain becomes structure, when empathy becomes power, not power over others, power within. And from this moment on, the empath begins to rise through distinct psychological stages, stages Jung outlined long before modern psychology gave them labels, stages that end with something rare, an empath who cannot be manipulated, an empath who sees through masks instantly, an empath who no longer confuses love with self-erasure. Carl Jung never used the modern word empath the way we do today, but he absolutely described them. He described a certain psychological type deeply attuned to the emotional field, highly responsive to others' inner states, instinctively oriented toward meaning rather than dominance. What Jung noticed was that these people do not remain the same throughout life. They evolve, and that evolution follows three distinct phases. Most people never leave the first. Many suffer endlessly in the second. Very few reach the third, and narcissists fear the third more than exposure. The first phase is the unconscious empath. This is where empathy begins. The unconscious empath feels everything but understands almost nothing about why. They absorb moods. They internalize blame. They feel responsible for other people's pain. They mistake emotional intensity for intimacy. They mistake trauma bonding for love. They mistake self-sacrifice for virtue. At this level, empathy is porous. There are no boundaries because boundaries feel cruel. The unconscious empath believes, if I just love harder, explain better, forgive deeper, they'll change. Jung would say, this empath is identified with the shadow of others. They carry what others refuse to face. And narcissists instinctively recognize this, not consciously, instinctively, like a predator sensing an open nervous system. This is why narcissists are drawn to empaths so quickly. The empath mirrors. The empath listens. The empath validates. But what the empath thinks is connection is actually projection. The narcissist projects an ideal self. The empath projects hope, and both believe the illusion for very different reasons. Eventually, something fractures because empathy without selfhood becomes exhaustion, and exhaustion forces awareness. Which brings us to the second phase. The wounded awakening empath. This is the most painful stage. This is where the empath realizes, I've been giving life to something that feeds on me. Jung called this the encounter with the shadow. Not the narcissist's shadow, the empath's own. Anger they were trained to suppress. Boundaries they were told were selfish. Instincts they were taught to doubt. This is the stage of confusion. They swing between compassion and rage, between guilt and clarity, between leaving and staying. They see the manipulation, but still feel responsible. They understand the pattern, but still hope it will change. This is where narcissists fight hardest to regain control. Why? Because awareness weakens the spell. At this stage, narcissists escalate. They gaslight more subtly. They play victim more convincingly. They alternate cruelty and affection. This is not strategy, it is panic. Because Jung understood something crucial. Once someone becomes conscious of a complex, the complex begins to lose power. And the narcissistic dynamic is a complex, a psychic loop, fueled by unconscious participation. The wounded empath often asks, why does it hurt so much even after I see the truth? Because awareness comes before integration. Seeing the poison is not the same as neutralizing it. This phase is the dark night of empathy, but it is also the gateway. Then comes the third phase, the sovereign empath. This is the stage Jung rarely saw, but deeply respected. The sovereign empath does not lose empathy. They master it. They no longer merge emotionally. They observe. They no longer over-explain. They speak once, clearly. They no longer seek to be understood. They understand themselves. This empath has integrated their shadow. Anger becomes discernment. Sensitivity becomes perception. Compassion becomes choice. And here is the part narcissists cannot tolerate. The sovereign empath does not react. No emotional supply, no defense, no collapse, just presence. Jung believed individuation culminates in inner authority, not domination, not control, authority over one's psychic energy. This empath is no longer available for psychological vampirism because they no longer leak identity. They are anchored, and anchored people are immune to manipulation. The narcissist feels this shift instantly, even if nothing is said. The empath's energy no longer responds to hooks. No guilt, no urgency, no emotional chase. And suddenly, the narcissist is alone with themselves, which is the one place they cannot survive. This transformation does not happen overnight. It unfolds internally, quietly, through awareness, integration, and self-ownership. What once felt like weakness becomes structure. What once felt like softness becomes stability. The empath no longer asks, "Who am I to others?" but "Who am I to myself?" And in that shift, something irreversible forms. The empath stops negotiating their reality. They stop carrying emotions that do not belong to them. They stop confusing love with endurance. They stop mistaking attachment for destiny. They begin to stand inside their own nervous system instead of orbiting around someone else's. And when that happens, manipulation dissolves because it requires participation to exist. The narcissist senses the loss long before words confirm it. The tone changes, the rhythm breaks, the hooks no longer catch, the emotional gravity vanishes. The empath hasn't become cold, they have become clear, and clarity is unbearable to systems built on distortion. What remains is not hostility, not revenge, not performance, but quiet authority. An empath who no longer bleeds for connection. An empath who no longer trades truth for belonging. An empath who has finally learned that empathy without selfhood is depletion, but empathy with sovereignty is liberation. Part 3. The Rise Method and the End of Psychological Vampirism. Carl Jung believed real change does not happen just by thinking differently. It happens when the psyche reorganizes itself, not through affirmations, not through willpower, but through conscious confrontation with what has been avoided. This is where the empath's awakening stops being emotional and becomes structural. To understand this, we need to look at what Jung would recognize as a four-stage movement of individuation. What we'll call the Rise Method, not a trick, not a routine, but a psychological sequence. Once it starts, it cannot be undone. The first movement is recognition. Recognition is brutal. This is the moment the empath stops romanticizing suffering. They begin to see patterns instead of isolated moments. They stop asking, "Why are they like this?" and start asking, "Why am I still here?" Jung emphasized that projection dissolves the moment responsibility returns to the self. This is not self-blame, it is self-reclamation. The empath realizes their empathy has been unbounded, not virtuous. Their loyalty has been misplaced, not noble. Their exhaustion is information, not failure. And this recognition shatters the narcissist's leverage because manipulation depends on confusion to survive. The second movement is integration. This is the most misunderstood step. Integration does not mean forgiveness. It does not mean understanding the narcissist better. It means integrating the empath's disowned traits, their anger, their refusal, their ability to walk away without explanation. Jung warned that what we repress does not disappear. It controls us from underneath. The empath who represses anger becomes compliant. The empath who integrates anger becomes discerning. This is where the empath stops being morally predictable, and predictability is exactly what narcissists depend on. At this point, something strange happens. The empath feels less emotional, but more alive, less reactive, but more present. They are no longer split inside themselves. They no longer outsource their shadow to others. They carry it consciously. And a conscious shadow is not dangerous. It is protective. It creates internal gravity. Instead of leaking energy outward, the empath begins to hold it inward. The third movement is separation. This is not physical distance. This is psychic withdrawal. The empath stops explaining their inner world to someone committed to misunderstanding it. They stop arguing with distorted reality. They stop chasing accountability from people who benefit from avoiding it. Jung described this as withdrawing projections. Energy returns to its source. And when that happens, the narcissist experiences something terrifying. Not rejection, not abandonment, but irrelevance. And irrelevance is worse. This is why narcissists often try to provoke reactions during this phase. Anger, tears, drama, anything. Because even negative attention restores connection. But the empath is no longer emotionally available, not closed but complete. They are not cold. They are finished participating in loops that consume without giving back. The narcissist feels the cord dissolve, and without that cord, psychological control collapses. The fourth movement is embodiment. This is the final shift. The empath no longer thinks differently. They exist differently. Their nervous system changes. Their posture changes. Their voice slows. They no longer rush to fill silence. They trust their internal authority. Jung believed this is when the self, not the ego, becomes the organizing center of the psyche. From this state, manipulation doesn't even register. It has no landing surface anymore. Now the difference becomes clear. Psychological vampirism feeds on reaction. Conscious empathy operates from choice. Vampirism collapses without supply. Conscious empathy does not require permission to exist. The sovereign empath can feel deeply without giving access. They can love without disappearing. They can witness pain without absorbing it. And this is why awakened empaths become unsettling to narcissists, not because they attack, but because they cannot be consumed. In this state, empathy is no longer self-sacrifice. It is perception with structure. The empath does not lose softness. They gain containment. They stop confusing availability with love. They stop equating endurance with connection. They become selective with energy, not defensive, but sovereign. And sovereignty is invisible to people who only understand control. Part 4. The Empathic Warrior and the End of the Mask. Carl Jung never believed the goal of psychological development was goodness. He believed the goal was wholeness. Goodness without strength collapses. Strength without empathy corrupts. But when empathy and strength integrate, something rare forms, not a savior, not a victim, not a fighter, an empathic warrior. The empathic warrior does not battle others, they battle inner fragmentation. They do not try to expose narcissists. They allow narcissists to expose themselves through irrelevance. Jung understood that once the self becomes the organizing center of the psyche, external chaos loses authority. The empathic warrior does not need to dominate. They do not need to win arguments. They do not need to be believed because their reality is internally confirmed. This is why narcissists eventually leave awakened empaths. Not because they are defeated, but because there is nothing left to extract. No admiration, no guilt, no emotional turbulence, only calm, grounded presence. And presence cannot be manipulated. It offers no hooks. It gives no leverage. It does not beg to be understood. It simply is. Jung spoke often about the persona, the mask. The mask is useful early in life. It helps us survive society. But when the mask becomes the whole identity, it turns into a prison. Narcissists live inside their persona. They must perform continuously. They must be seen. They must be validated. Their nervous system depends on reflection. The empathic warrior, by contrast, no longer needs to be seen. They see. And that gaze, calm, clear, unreactive, becomes unbearable to someone who survives on illusion. Because illusion needs participation. It needs emotional mirrors, and the empathic warrior no longer provides them. This is the final irony. The empath never wanted power, but power found them anyway the moment they stopped abandoning themselves. Why? Because the fed-up empath is truly dangerous. Not dangerous in behavior, but dangerous to dysfunction, dangerous to cycles, dangerous to unconsciousness. The fed-up empath no longer rescues. They no longer explain abuse away. They no longer spiritualize suffering. They leave systems that require self-erasure to function, and systems like that collapse the moment empathy exits. Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." The fed-up empath does exactly that, including their anger, including their limits, including their refusal to be consumed. And from that acceptance comes a quiet authority that cannot be negotiated with. The final truth is simple. Empathy was never meant to be endless giving. It was meant to be perception. The empath's sensitivity was not a flaw. It was training. Training to see beneath masks. Training to feel subtle shifts. Training to recognize when something is no longer alive. Once that training completes, the empath does not return to innocence. They return to truth. And truth does not shout. It does not convince. It does not chase. It stands. If this reached you, it was not entertainment. It was recognition. And recognition is always the first movement of freedom.